Hey everyone, I am back to talk about week 3, part 2. It's super late in the week. I apologize for falling behind. I recorded, and a lot of you have already looked at a week 3, part 1. And to be honest, I was a little embarrassed about the quality on that, but I was going to reshoot it, and then I was already exhausted when I did it, and I said, I'm just going to put it up there. And then I've been really sheepish about recording again, but I also realized that I need to stop letting the good be the enemy of the okay and just get some material up for y'all. So I'm going to catch up on week 3, part 2 here. Let's get my head out of the way. And some really important, interesting stuff, super relevant to today, as usual. Really quickly, I'm not going over the articles because you have an assignment on them, and I hope they're fairly obvious. But if you want to talk to me about them, you're always welcome to drop in office hours or shoot an email or whatever. I'm happy to discuss. Uh, there is an optional reading here that's really good about the problem that Whelan brought up of being careful what you incentivize when you're measuring things, because you can create some really tough incentives or difficult incentives for people to come up with, and they end up trying to get around them. I thought this article was really good because it without apologizing for it, painted a really sympathetic portrait of a teacher who really cared about teaching his students, but also was incentivized to cheat. And again, it doesn't make too many excuses. It says, he lost his job and he'll never teach again. But it also helps you understand some of the pressures that were going on in the school district to try and increase test scores for students no matter what. So that's an interesting reading. And then the on bullshit reading, I'm going to leave up to you. I'm going to put up an assignment for y'all that has a question about on bullshit. And so there's a slide deck for it and the reading's right there. So I'll leave that for now. I want to move on to week 3, part 2, where we read this excellent chapter from Best. This is our last chapter on Joel Best on the topic of lies, damned lies, and statistics. And this chapter is really good because it's about the idea of comparing things poorly, inappropriate comparisons. Again, a recurrent theme in our classes, we're learning a lot about how things are done poorly or twisted or deliberately misrepresented in statistics, but not with a goal to learn that things are always broken or you can't trust anything, but with a goal to understanding when it can work and under what circumstances it might not work. The best readings tend to be a little bit more in the line of here's how this isn't right, or here's how it's broken, or here's how messed up this is. And I always want to make sure to remind us that we're also thinking about how this can be useful or powerful or meaningful. On we go into the problem of inappropriate comparisons. Best breaks down inappropriate comparisons into a number of different domains. The first domain of inappropriate comparison he talks about is comparisons over time, which is either a comparison between now and a time in the past. Happens a lot, right? If you talk to an older person especially, they'll talk about how things used to be better in this regard or used to be worse in that regard. Or sometimes we look at now compared to the future, and the future is always unknown and fundamentally unknowable, but that doesn't stop us from trying to think about the future and project into the future. And then sometimes we look at comparisons over time, not just between now and a time in the past, but we look at the progress of something over a long period of time. We look for a trend, either something's increasing or it's decreasing or it's staying the same. We get really interested in that with respect to things like the growth in the number of cases of coronavirus or the growth in the number of deaths due to the coronavirus, for example. There's a few problems that Best points out around comparisons between time periods. One is that measures might change. And now remember in our earlier reading from Best, he made a distinction between defining and measuring. And here we're agreeing that there's sort of a universal idea about what the thing is we're trying to measure, the definition, but the way we measure it might change. In other words, we might start counting more of the thing or start counting less of the things. An example from earlier in the quarter that we used was the way we measure domestic violence might change. So even if we have the same definition of domestic violence, we might count it differently now than we did 20 years ago, right? So for instance, 20 or 30 years ago, the case records for domestic violence might have just been the number of times that the police were called for a DV related incident, or it might even be the number of times the police were called and made an arrest related to DV. Or maybe it was the number of times the police were called, made an arrest, and there was a conviction of domestic violence. Today, it might be a survey where people report whether they have experienced domestic violence in the last year. Those two things are measuring the same thing, but domestic violence, but you're going to get a lot more cases if you don't rely on the number of police calls and the number of arrests that are made. So that change might make it seem, in the case of domestic violence, for instance, domestic violence, I would argue, has been probably decreasing overall since the 1950s or 1960s. I see that my evidence for that, or the reason for my belief in that, is that I think social mores have changed to where it is seen as less acceptable now than it was 20, 50, 100 years ago. But at the same time, we might see the statistic for domestic violence increasing because people are more willing to report it, and it's being reported and measured differently than it was. Another example of a changing measure is the way we count coronavirus deaths. So something I brought up in an earlier video for y'all was that coronavirus deaths weren't being counted as coronavirus deaths unless there was a positive test swab. But there were bodies turning up that no one was bothering to test. So is that a coronavirus death or not? What started happening is now that excess deaths are being counted presumptively as coronavirus because we don't have a credible thing that we think is killing people in excess numbers aside from coronavirus. So that's a changing measure. So a spike in deaths like we saw in New York in the last week was due to the changing nature of the reporting, not an actual increase in coronavirus infection or mortality. Unchanging measures can be a problem as well, Best points out. Best uses the example of worker productivity as a problematic measure. Worker productivity is usually measured using a standard established when a lot of workers were working in assembly lines on factory floors in industry. When you have an assembly line product, you can measure the amount of time and energy a worker puts into their step of the process, and you can estimate the value added by each worker along each step. So if you have a bunch of raw materials come in and a finished product go out at the end of a process, you can take the value added to that product and divide by the total number of workers and the hours they spend and come up with a measure of worker productivity. And you can even subdivide it based on individuals' jobs along the production line chain. The problem with this, Best points out, is that a lot of workers don't work that way anymore. Workers work in teams. Workers work on projects that are difficult to break down into itemized value-added sort of figures. For example, software teams, programming teams, developers, people working in IT more generally. It's very hard to itemize the individual contribution of a single worker or even measure the contribution of a team if you have many, many teams all working on a massive project. So Best points out that productivity measures are stuck in the 1970s when here we are in the 2020s, we're still using them. Another example of this that's quite relevant today is these measures of unemployment that we see used. If we look over here on the left-hand side, what we see is there's a U1 through a U6. And I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but if you're curious about this, if you've ever heard the claim that in the United States there's something like 65 million people unemployed or something like this, that number is actually not anywhere in here, but that number is accurate if you count everybody who's in college and everybody who's retired as unemployed. And I don't think you want to ask retirees if they really should be counted towards the unemployed. They're retired for a reason, right? So these numbers have always been a source of political friction, or people have tried to weaponize the unemployment numbers or criticize the unemployment numbers. Great example of this is President Donald Trump under Obama, Donald Trump made disparaging, attacking comments about the unemployment rate, saying there was no way it was accurate, accused the Bureau of Labor Statistics of the Bureau of Labor Statistics of cooking the books and making just to make Obama look good, and said they shouldn't be trusted. There was no way the unemployment rate was as low as that the BLS was saying it was. And then, of course, once Trump won the presidency, he turned right around and started crowing about those amazing unemployment numbers. So a statistic that was completely invalid to him a few months before suddenly became really important, right? So the irony of that notwithstanding, the source of some of people's conflict, and by the way, President Trump is not far from the only person who's criticized the measurement of unemployment in the United States. But some of the source of legitimate confusion about how unemployment is measured and whether unemployment is being measured accurately is that people don't always like the definition that's being used, and people have argued at various times that it's not a good measure, that the measure should be changed. In brief, U1 is the most restrictive definition of unemployment. Those are people who have just been laid off, okay? And the U6 measure is the least restrictive, the most broadest definition of unemployment. What we see, if you look over here on the right-hand side, what you'll see is that U1 is a very low number and that U6 is a very high number. Now, if you wanted to play games with statistics and you wanted to be deceptive about it, you could just point to the low number and say things are great, and point to the high number and say things are bad. But the number the BLS reports, the official unemployment statistic, when we hear about unemployment changed by this much, the official statistic is this middle figure, the U3, the official unemployment rate, you can see there. That measures people who have been laid off from work and are actively looking for work. And I believe it is, there's a time period after which you fall off the U3 roll. I can't remember what time period that is. During the last Great Recession, if you became a discouraged worker, which is that you couldn't find work for a certain period of time, and then after that time period had elapsed, then you didn't get counted towards the U3 measure. People were highly critical of the U3 measure because they argued it was undercounting the total unemployment rate at that time. Now, today, we run the risk of U3 undercounting total unemployment because you need to be recently laid off. That works. We have lots of people recently laid off, millions and millions of people recently laid off. But you also need to answer yes to the question, are you currently looking for work? So in other words, there's a lot of people today, because of the coronavirus-related shutdowns, who have been laid off, and I guarantee you aren't looking for work because nothing's open and no one's hiring. So we might argue then that that measure should be changed because it's not accurately reflecting the number of people who have been laid off and have given up hope of looking for work because everything's shut. That's a good example of this challenge of unchanging measures, right? What we're relying on right now is the total number of jobless claims, people who are claiming employment insurance or the like, unemployment insurance. But that measure is going to fade over time, and we need to know how many people are actually unemployed, and that's going to be a difficult challenge to measure that accurately. And it's going to make it hard to compare the impact of the current recession we're in to previous recessions for that reasons. And then finally, we need to be careful about projecting into the future because we could have a little bit of an upward trend and then look into the future and say, wow, things are going to be great. We see this happening with startups, with business all the time. We see a new restaurant opening and people think that it's going to be great because they get a surge of business when they start, and then they expand and then they don't do as well as they necessarily thought they would. Startups in all kinds of different industries think they're going to be doubling their income every quarter, and then it turns out it's a lot harder than that once they start encountering challenges to growth. So that can be a challenge. We also want to be very careful about projections when we have, say, the early stages of a disease outbreak like coronavirus, because some of the early projections made around the death tolls in the United States were pretty pessimistic, arguably well modeled and accurate, but on the assumption that people didn't do anything to try and slow the transmission of the disease. And that's where we have to be very careful with projections, is the projections are only as accurate as the assumptions that are made. And they can be really exaggerated if we don't make good assumptions, or especially when we have a really early series of data and then we're looking far into the future. The next domain of comparisons that BEST considers is comparisons among places. This is a very intuitive thing to do. We see it done all the time internationally. The first lecture I recorded for y'all, I put up a video, a demonstration of this where we compared the United States child mortality to other economically developed, but not as wealthy as the United States child mortality. And we saw that there was lower child mortality in countries that were even a little less wealthy than the United States. And that, I just invited you to think about why that might be. That's a comparison among different places, right? We see this, by the way, too, when we talk about things like the United States and firearm safety or deaths caused by firearms, including suicides. We see the United States compares very poorly to places that have more restrictive gun ownership rights. So that's a common international comparison that's done. We see state level comparisons done as well, comparing there are some state level comparisons on coronavirus infection rates and mortality that are being done today. There can be problems with comparing between places. One can be that we can have some kind of a different definition of what counts or doesn't count from place to place. That is a factor of how we measure it, not how we measure it, even how we define what is measured. So something that checks the box and adds 1 to the total in one country might not check the box and add to the total in another one. And a couple examples too of problematic comparisons between places that BEST brings up are cultural differences between places, and this has to do with measurement, but a little bit in a different way. And one of the examples BEST brings up is that of Japanese lawyers, and this is commonly used by people who don't like law or the supposed litigious nature of American society, and they will point to Japan and say Japan manages to have a very successful economy, but people don't sue each other as often, and look at how few lawyers they have compared to the United States. Per 100,000 people, there's X number of lawyers, and in the United States there's 10 times more, or whatever the number is. I don't know what it is, but they'll claim that there's way more lawyers in the United States than there are in Japan. And that number is only true if you look at the very superficial way that being a lawyer is defined in Japan versus it is in the United States, which is that people who go to law school in Japan but then end up working in a legal department for a major firm, which, by the way, most lawyers in the United States do as well. In Japan, they're not counted as lawyers because they don't need to take the equivalent of the bar exam. In the United States, to work in a position that you'd hire a lawyer for, whether it's within a company or as an independent lawyer, you need to take the bar exam. So the way we count lawyers in the United States is everyone who takes the bar exam. If we count lawyers in Japan the same way as having passed the equivalent test in Japan, then it's much smaller, because most people who go to law school and come out and do the same kind of things that lawyers do don't hang up a sign outside of an office and say, Tim Sharks, attorney at law, accepting private clients. Most of them go and work in-house for a firm and never have to take that exam. So it turns out if you count people who graduate from law school and work in law, Japan and the United States are very comparable. So the comparison is unfair is the point. Another example that BEST gives is the difference in high school outcomes between places like the United States and places like Germany. And I give BEST the benefit of the doubt here, but I also want to point out that there can be a fair comparison as long as we understand the difference. And that is, if we look at high school graduation rates in the United States, they're pretty low compared to a lot of other places. BEST points out that in high school in Germany, only a few students, not a few, but there's a subset of students who do go on to continue high school with the intention of completing high school to go to college, with the intention of going to college. And then another subset of that student population doesn't go with the intention of completing college, and their last few years of high school are quite different. They're more trades oriented, so they learn really valuable job skills that they end up working from the age of like 18 or 19, working in a mechanic shop or working as a machinist or working in all kinds of different important trades. So best point about this is that if you compare test scores for American high school students to, say, German high school students, you're comparing only the test scores of those students in Germany that had gone into the track where they were planning on going to university, whereas we're going on to college, right? Whereas in the United States, we're testing everybody with the assumption that we all go on to college. Here's where I want to back up a minute, though, and say, now hold on a second. Isn't that fair for Germany to only apply a how ready are you for college test to the students that are really planning on going to college? And isn't that really unfair for the United States to be giving everybody a test on the assumption that they should all go to college and nobody should end up in trades? Because trades is a really important job and pays well, and you can be earning money from 18 or 19 years old and saving it and having a really, stable, secure, economically secure career. So I would invite you to consider that maybe it's not the apples and oranges comparisons that's flawed. It's that we're in the United States pretending like every student is the same, and that Germany's model is the wrong model. Like maybe it has some advantages, right? Just inviting that comparison. The best point is well taken, which is that we shouldn't compare test scores for all students in the U.S. to only a few students in Germany. All right. Comparing between groups is quite common as well. Now, keep in mind that when we talk about comparison among groups, we're not talking about comparisons by geography. Those are two groups, Group A and Group B as well, right? But they're in two different places. We're not talking about comparing groups over time as well, which is comparisons over time. Now we're saying same time, same place, Group A and Group B. I hope that's clear, right? So we're talking about a different domain now. When we compare between Japan and the United States, for example, there's an implicit comparison between groups there as well, but best is putting that in the domain of problems of comparison between places. Comparison among groups happens when we look at one group and another group in the same place at the same time, and we say which one is better or worse off in this regard, whatever we're measuring, right? We do this a lot, and sometimes we do it problematically, right? One of the things that Best points out right away is that it's really problematic when we use a number of cases when the groups differ in size. So, for example, we might have one group that's much, much smaller than another group, and so therefore it's going to have smaller numbers of whatever the thing is we're measuring, no matter what, right? And then the other problem we end up with is we sometimes use the definition of the group to be what we think. We assume that the definition of the group difference is the cause of any other statistical difference. And this is this last part. We divide them on one measure when another one is likely in play. And the example that Best gives here is the idea of race versus class, which is, it can be problematic, which is that we don't measure people's socioeconomic scores. We don't have even a crude measure of their class when we're making arrests, but police always write down the race of the suspect. So we can see a really big difference in race sometimes when, in fact, really it might be a factor of class that might be a better explanation of some of the difference that we see in this, whatever we're trying to measure. All right. Last but not least, super relevant to COVID-19 is comparison among social problems. I know you have seen some of these someplace about COVID-19. Problem X kills more people than whatever, right? Now we see this both ways. The main way I've seen it is I've seen people saying, look at how many people died from this cause or that cause, and it's a way bigger number than deaths from COVID-19. So therefore, let's not worry about COVID-19 is the implication, right? However, I've also seen a few cases where people have said, look at how many more people COVID-19 has killed than X, Y, or Z, right? So that, therefore, it's bigger than all those other problems, so we should worry about it. That kind of comparison makes some common sense because it gives us a scale to put, a reference to put the problem in the light of. For example, I saw the number of deaths in America from COVID-19 compared to the number of deaths to Americans from the entire global war on terror. And that was an interesting comparison to make, right? Which is the sort of like, how much should we care about this thing compared to this other thing, what we've obviously spent 2 decades caring a lot about. So there are problems with it, right? And all this best examples, I think, were a little bit hard for students to wrap their heads around sometimes, but I think now it's super relevant because we have COVID-19 in the news every day. So is the most important consideration dollars or lives? I wrote this PowerPoint or this slide deck way before people started talking about reopening the economy would be worth it even if it killed a bunch of people. But that is one of the questions that people keep bringing up these days. I think under very I think their logic is fundamentally flawed because my view of it, from my understanding of the issue, is that it's not a question of reopening the economy and having dollars and costing lives, or closing the economy and losing dollars but saving lives, because either we keep the economy closed and lose dollars and save lives now, or we reopen the economy and then lose lives and lose dollars. So the question to me is saving lives or not saving lives, because either way we'll lose a lot of money. We'll lose a lot of money from keeping the economy closed, or we'll lose a lot of money from reopening the economy. And that's my view of it. I have a hard time seeing how we could reopen the economy and just be all hunky-dory and making a ton of money while our hospitals are overwhelmed and people are afraid to go out in public because the pandemic is everywhere. Maybe I'm not creative enough or imaginative enough. I don't know. It's hard for me to wrap my head around how it could be how it could really be a trade-off. But this is the kind of question that we see happening right now, and Bess brings this up, which is, well, what are we measuring, right? Another issue that's come up with this idea about when we consider dollars or lives, if we're considering social problem A or social problem B, and shutting the economy down is a social problem. Let's not lie about that, right? But so is the spread of a global pandemic. So if we're talking about this question of cost benefit, one of the things that keeps coming up is the idea that, first of all, incorrectly, but the idea that only old people die. Mostly old people die, but a lot of people in younger years get fairly sick, and some of them die as well. But the argument has been made, again, one I cannot wrap my head around personally, but maybe you all have more insight into this than I do. One of the arguments I've heard and read has been that old people are worth less than young people, and it's sort of a Machiavellian sort of logic, but a lot of old people tend to agree with that. My own father, for one, has said that sort of thing. And we do tend to measure that when we measure the value of a statistical life. We do discount the life of older people in terms of their relative value. But this is something that comes up in these sort of policy debates sometimes. Doctors have to make that decision when they're deciding who to save, right? When the emergency room is full and they have only one more ventilator, doctors have to make a decision about who gets the ventilator and who doesn't, and very often they choose somebody who is younger and healthier than somebody who is older and weaker and sicker. So these questions aren't just internet like troll points. They're also real life considerations we need to worry about. So I guess I said I didn't understand some people's perspectives. I don't understand the trolling perspectives about it. I can empathize with the ethical difficulty of having to make that decision. In these really impossible situations. So that's a job I'm glad I do not have. Let's put it that way. All right. So comparability of social problems. This is at the heart of the apples and oranges comparisons that are happening today with respect to coronavirus and other diseases, because people will compare the number of deaths to car accidents, or the number of deaths to cancer, the number of deaths to World War II, or whatever the cause of death might be. And they'll say, well, that's bigger than coronavirus, but we didn't shut the country down for that, did we? And the answer is always no, because traffic accidents are not contagious. Being socially isolated, well, actually, being socially isolated would bring down the number of traffic deaths, right? But cancer isn't contagious, and so staying socially isolated and shutting down businesses across the country won't do anything to reduce the number of cancer cases, which is why we don't shut down the country over cancer, right? So this is the problem about comparability of social problems when we talk about coronavirus, is we can't compare a non-contagious cause of death to a contagious cause of death and argue that the solutions should be the same, or that they shouldn't differ considerably. All right. The last thing that Best points out here is that highlighting the most susceptible group might exaggerate the importance. And we see that happening a little bit with coronavirus as well, where estimates of death tolls can be pretty dramatic in terms of the death rate. If we look at the death rates among the most susceptible group, it is shockingly high. But we do know that the younger someone is in general, the lower the death rate appears to be. We have some reasonable data around that to suspect that younger people are more likely to experience milder symptoms and sometimes almost none, and that older people are more likely to experience severe symptoms, including life-threatening and lethal symptoms. So if we want to emphasize the power of the virus and its danger, then we can look at its death rate among more susceptible populations instead of the population at large. Now, the other side of that coin is to emphasize how unlikely it is, and we'll see that kind of rhetoric around as well. Best argues this is done sometimes to try and get attention to an issue that otherwise might be relatively trivial. So you point out a group that's at risk of something and say, look at how big a deal this is. We should all care about it. But the potential apples and oranges about that is I can look at that and say, I'm not part of that group. Why should I care again, right? However, that's not to say that we shouldn't care about something. And this is a little addendum to the Best. I'm just editorializing now. But the highlighting the most susceptible group might exaggerate its importance, but what if we're clear about our concern for that group? So, for example, highlighting the uptick in suicides among active and returned service members from the global war on terror. I think that's a real social problem, and I think it deserves our attention. So I don't think it's sensational to be pointing it out. I don't think anyone is arguing that we should worry about suicide across all society when they point out that that number has gone up and is unacceptably high, right? I think it's something that we should be concerned about as an issue in itself. So I don't think that necessarily every time we point out that there's a group that's more susceptible to a problem, it means that we're trying to amplify it. We're just saying, hey, this is an issue for this group and we should be concerned about it. All right, let's wrap it all up here and talk about making good comparisons. Now, we know that comparisons are useful because we do them all the time, right? We just want to make sure that we make good comparisons. First of all, we want to know how big a problem is relative to some other problem because that can help us set our own priorities, right? And not just whether something is large or small compared to something else, but also whether it's growing or shrinking. It's smaller or larger than some other, than it would be in another location, than it would be among another group, than it is compared to some other social problem. So something that's growing in size or intensity, we need to be more concerned about. Something that's shrinking, we can be a little less concerned about, right? That's been one of the messages around coronavirus lately, has been that the number of deaths per day has not been increasing dramatically in most of the hotspots. And that's a good sign, because if it was increasing, then it would mean that there were more and more infections, and therefore the measures we had put in place would not be as effective. We have pretty decent evidence by now that the measures put in place are slowing the spread of the virus, limiting the total spread of the infection, and therefore keeping the number of deaths per day to a smaller number than they would if they were still growing exponentially. So it's not to say that it can't break out again, but it's encouraging to see that number not growing over time. This is a great quote from Best. Comparison depends on comparability. We need to make sure that we are comparing stats made with similar definitions and measures, right? If we're comparing something that's measured one way in one place or one way in one group and another way in another group, then it's not a fair comparison. Between similar times, so if we're talking about something that happened in 1890 and comparing that to something that's in 2020, obviously the whole world was different then, right? Similar geographies. So comparing, back to an early example I gave, comparing gun violence in the United States to gun violence in Switzerland, I think is a fair comparison because they're both economically developed democratic societies, right? Comparison gun violence in the United States to gun violence in El Salvador or Guatemala, I don't find it as fair of a comparison because the geographies of those places are very different, right? So people who want to show that the United States is a safe, responsible place because of gun ownership compare it to El Salvador. People who want to show the United States is dangerous because of guns compare it to a country in Europe that has, fewer gun deaths total. Now, I recognize that's one of the most inflammatory issues out there for people, and I know that people won't have their mind changed very easily by data. But think about that. Think about the comparability of geography the next time you to make that comparison. And then comparability between groups. If you compare groups of different size, make sure you're always looking at a rate or percentage. We've seen this, by the way, come up with coronavirus as well, which is that we've seen people emphasizing the number of cases between populations. Now, again, this is between countries too, but when the countries are very different size in population, we should be using a measure of not total cases, but per 1,000, 100,000, or per 1 million population, because some countries are much larger, some are much smaller. And then if we're comparing between groups, make sure that if the groups are not the same size, that we always use a percentage or a different rate, like a per 100,000 or per 1 million, to compare them, not the absolute number of cases, because that can make a really unfair comparison. So we're always striving for apples to apples. All right. This is a little flashback to Whelan Chapter 3, which is a great example about how we can make different comparisons over time to be more or less fair depending on our own point we're trying to prove or the bias we're trying to support. This is Whelan's example of if I'm showing my presentation to a conservative audience and I want to talk about how great President Reagan was for strengthening the national defense, I show them this chart, which shows a steady growth in defense spending from 1981 all the way to 1988. Fantastic, looks great, right? But then if I have a more liberal audience and I want to talk about how Reagan discontinued what Carter did, then I show them this chart, which shows that defense spending increased dramatically under Carter as well. I can do the exact same thing by showing you the Dow Jones Industrial Average under President Trump and then expanding the scale to show it under Obama, because the trend was the same under both presidents until recently, of course, right? But the selecting what time you're comparing across can make a really different statement based on what you're trying to support, or how what your bias considers to be most important, depending on the scale, right? Really quickly, I want to review this reading, which is a really influential work. It's sort of amazing to me that we've known about this for 20 years, but we still haven't been able to do it effectively in schools. Standardized testing is pretty much here to stay in schools. People don't like it. Teachers especially don't like it. Cynically, teachers don't like it sometimes because they don't want to be held accountable. I can tell you as a teacher that I can empathize with that view a little bit, right? I don't think all teachers are that way, though. But one of the questions that we have is, how do we measure whether a school is doing its job of teaching our students or not? And I think we agree that some classes are better and some classes are worse. Some schools are better and some schools are worse, right? But how do we track whether they're good or bad? And the easy answer is we look at how good the students are coming out of them. The problem with that is that we know that students go into the schools with different strengths and different abilities. So if I put really good students into a mediocre school, they'll probably still come out pretty well. Whereas if I put struggling students into a mediocre school, they won't come out so good, right? And so the challenge that this really short article presents is, well, how do we measure whether an individual teacher or a classroom or a school is doing its job? The problem is, and this is one of apples and oranges here, if I compare this year's 8th grade class to last year's 8th grade class, and this year's 8th grade class does better than last year's 8th grade class, do I know that it's because the school is doing better, or is it because I have a different group of 8th graders? Or if this year's 8th grade class does worse than last year's 8th grade class, do I know it's because the school is doing worse, or is it because I have a mix of students that has more challenges? So standardized testing has always been subject to this accusation, which is you test all the 8th graders, but they're not testing the same 8th graders every time. You're testing this year's 8th graders compared to last year's 8th graders, and this year's 8th graders are different than last year's 8th graders. We're making an argument that we're comparing between different groups. This year's 8th graders, last year's 8th graders. You could argue it's a comparison between times too, right? But they're different. You're not measuring the same group either. So what Rothstein proposes here, I think very clearly, very kind of obviously, is what we need to measure is value-added analysis, which is we measure all the students at the end of 7th grade, and then we measure them all at the end of 8th grade. And we do that every year. And what we establish is a benchmark for what kind of standard progress we can expect students to make in 1 year of time. So we're measuring the same students twice. And then we add the value added. The increase the students make over that 1 year is the combined total of the classroom effects plus whatever the individual student brought to the room. And we should expect to see some classrooms make a bigger bump in student performance and other classrooms make a smaller bump in student performance. So why don't we do that? Well, we require 2 tests, right? So all the students would have to sit for a test at the end of the 7th grade and a test at the end of the 8th grade. And also there's some pushback because it might result in some schools and classrooms being held accountable, and status quo seems to support things being easy for everybody so far. All right. And then last but not least, I have a bunch of questions here about the IWPR working paper here. I assigned the first 6 pages. But the short story about this is I want you to read through and answer these questions on your own. I'm not going to answer them for you right now, but I'll give you the very summary version of it, which is that when we look at causes of the gender wage gap, it turns out that there is a quite complex story going on with it, and there are multiple factors at play that contribute to the gender wage gap. It's not one single explanation. There's many different causes that contribute to the gender wage gap. There's differences. It's not just all men versus women. There's differences within women based on ethnicity and education, and then age difference as well. So what we see is that there's a multi-causal story to be told here, which is we're not talking about apples and oranges necessarily here, but we're looking at more slices of the apple, if you will, and it turns out there's more than one explanation. All right, I think that's all I want to say. I'm going to go back to the course module and make sure I didn't forget anything. That's it. We got through it all in about 45 minutes. I'm proud of myself. More coming soon. Thanks, and y'all have a great day.